March 20th, 44 BC. Julius Caesar has been dead at this point for 5 days. His murderers have been given official amnesty, and Mark Antony, who was Rome's chief executive, the consul, is now about to preside over the funeral of Julius Caesar. Everyone would have been at this funeral, Caesar's friends and also his enemies. His family, too, were there, his widow, his relatives, all of them probably seething amidst the crowd as they stood next to some of the very men who had stabbed Caesar to death. It had to be one of the most awkward family funerals in history. And while everyone agreed, it seemed, to just get the thing over with, there was one man who decided that he was going to set this thing on fire. Pretty quickly, the sham of a funeral was transformed into a raging riot, and the arsonist was Mark Antony. We'll talk about what he said and what he did on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 3, Death at a Funeral. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people gathered in Rome for the funeral of Gaius Julius Caesar. And on that day, many of those people would hear for the first time what the contents were of Julius Caesar's will. Now, they were probably shocked, just like Mark Antony and many others were, that Caesar had decided to name not Mark Antony or Lepidus as his heir, but his 19-year-old nephew Octavius. But the best news for the masses that were gathered at Caesar's funeral was that he had left them some very kingly gifts. He had some palatial gardens that he decided to leave to the public as a place of recreation. And out of his vast fortune, Caesar left each Roman citizen 75 silver denarii, 75 silver coins. This is enough money to buy a year's worth of food for an individual adult. And you have to wonder if while these gifts were being proclaimed over the crowd, if some began to question the decision to grant amnesty to the killers of a man who had obviously loved the masses so much as to give them these gifts. The Romans also had some deeply embedded ideas about patronage. If these people took Caesar's money, if they took Caesar's gifts, they needed, by obligation, to be loyal to him and those who were his heirs. Would loyal clients allow their patrons' murderers to go unpunished? In his account of the civil wars, Appian tells us that some people in the crowd at this point began to pull out weapons, and they began to publicly repent that they supported amnesty. Some of the boldest men even begun to surround Caesar's body. No doubt as the assassins were there, they started looking around nervously. The conspirators had to start to wonder if this funeral was going to turn into something that they didn't want to be around for. The Roman Forum was becoming very uncomfortable very quickly. But then Mark Antony stood up. He was preparing to deliver the funeral oration for his friend Caesar. And Plutarch, one of the first biographers in history, wrote a rich and engaging biography of Mark Antony in the late 1st century AD. And Plutarch gives us one account about what happened next. And this is perhaps Mark Antony's greatest moment. Here's what Plutarch says, quote, "Antony saw that the people were mightily swayed and charmed by his words. He mingled with his praises sorrow and indignation over the dreadful deed, and at the close of his speech shook on high the garments of Caesar, all bloody and tattered by the daggers, called on those who had wrought such work villains and murderers, and inspired his hearers with such rage that they heaped together benches and tables and burned Caesar's body in the forum, and then ran to the houses of the assassins and assaulted them." That's Plutarch in his biography of Mark Antony. This placid, calm funeral that everybody was just trying to get through so that they could move on became total chaos. For Antony, it was a rhetorical masterstroke. He channeled the raw emotions of a sea of mourners into a hurricane of violence. The conspirators bolted from the forum, chased by enraged thugs who were given license to commit violence by Mark Antony's inflammatory eulogy. And no doubt many innocent people died, and these were probably acceptable collateral to Antony, because now that those who opposed him were fleeing the city in panic, he controlled Rome unopposed. In the coming days and weeks, Antony would use his consular power to redistribute land to Caesar's veterans. Here again was naked bribery, and for a purpose, because while Antony had put Caesar's assassins to flight, young Octavian, having heard that he had been named Caesar's heir, was on his way to Rome. Antony had a very limited window in which he could act before Octavian came back to claim his inheritance. Octavian had Caesar's name, but Antony had power and wealth. There would be a fight to earn the loyalty of Caesar's legions, the men who truly decided who would be Caesar's heir. Antony didn't have Caesar's name, but he might still be able to keep Caesar's soldiers if he played his cards right. So by the time Octavian arrived in Italy, about a month later, crowds of people and soldiers began to greet him. They followed him from the port of Brundisium all the way over into Rome. Antony, however, did not go to the gates of Rome to meet Caesar's heir, as he should have. So Octavian had to go and seek Antony out, asking the consul for Caesar's money so that he might pay out the bonuses that Caesar had promised. Instead, Antony insulted Octavian, and when it came to handing over Caesar's money, Antony began to stall. Now, think about this. Octavian is still a teenager at this point, and he's going up against a man with a lot more experience and a lot more worldly wisdom than he has. So did Octavian do what so many modern teenagers do? Go and sulk in his room and complain that life wasn't fair? No. Octavian decided to begin selling Caesar's property himself, maybe even borrowed against the inheritance that he was promised but had not yet fully received. And in doing those things, he raised the kind of money that a senator might earn over the course of his entire life. Hundreds of millions of sesterces, a vast sum. And if borrowing that kind of money wasn't shocking enough, what he did with it was just as ludicrous. Octavian gave the money away, gave it to Caesar's soldiers. Octavian wasn't being stupid. He was being very smart. Because not only was he fulfilling Caesar's promise himself, which of course made Caesar's soldiers happy, and it also put those soldiers in his debt, but by acting as Caesar, by fulfilling the vow that Caesar had made, Octavian was showing that he had the right to Caesar's name and all that that name entailed. He was showing that he wasn't some poser who happened to inherit Caesar's name and was unworthy of the title. This truly was Caesar's son, and Octavian was proving it. Octavian minted coins, maybe some of the very coins that were passed out to his soldiers, with images of Octavian's head on one side, along with his new name, Caesar. And Octavian also adopted and placed on some of those coins a new military title, Imperator, or Commander. Now, this title was normally awarded by the soldiers to their commanders after a major military victory. But Octavian was taking the title preemptively. And indeed, it worked. In addition to the private army that Octavian was gradually accumulating through both his name and through his payments, two of Mark Antony's own legions switched sides and joined Octavian. Octavian had begun with just a name, and now he had a full-blown private army. Now, not to be outdone, Mark Antony would also mint coins early on. And some of these had Caesar's head on one side and Antony's head on the other. Which side of the coin was heads and which was tails? It was impossible to say, and that was the point. Like Octavian, Mark Antony used coin imagery to suggest that he was a true heir of Caesar, even if he did not have the legal rights to Caesar's name. If you repeat a lie enough times, maybe it will be true. If you inscribe a lie on enough coins, maybe it will be true. Antony also became a priest to Julius Caesar's divinity. So Antony's head on these early coins was covered with a priestly robe and accompanied by priestly implements. He did this to remind people of his devotion to Caesar. A propaganda battle that would last for more than a decade had now started. But early on, the cosmos itself gave an initial victory to one of the two men. The biography of Caesar, written by the imperial secretary Suetonius, records the heavenly sign that was given. Quote, Caesar was numbered among the gods, in the conviction of the common people, for at the first of the games which his heir Octavian gave in honor of his becoming divine, a comet shone for 7 successive days, rising about the 11th hour, and was believed to be the soul of Caesar, who had been taken to heaven. That's Suetonius' Life of Caesar. Now, what is he talking about? Well, in the month of July, which is the month named after Caesar, Julius, July, and the month that Caesar was born in, a bright comet shone in the sky for several days. It could be actually seen during the day. It was so bright. And the common people interpreted that comet as Caesar's soul ascending to heaven to join the gods. Now, Octavian likely made sure that that's the interpretation they had. And why did he do that? Well, if Caesar was a god and Octavian was the son of Caesar, then ipso facto, Octavian was the son of a god. And how could Antony compete with that? He couldn't. And to make things worse for Antony, the leading man in the Senate, Marcus Tullius Cicero, began at that same time to publish speeches mocking Mark Antony. These speeches, which are known as the Philippics, mercilessly harangue Antony for various crimes and indiscretion, both in the present but also in the distant past. Cicero called Antony everything from a drunkard to a male prostitute. Let me give you just a very short excerpt from one of the longest of these Philippics. This one was delivered in October of 44 BC, about half a year after Caesar died. Quote, while you were still wearing the cloak of a boy, you became a bankrupt. When you assumed the robe of manhood, you made it into a womanly gown. At first, a public prostitute with a regular price for your wickedness, and that not cheaply. That's Cicero's second Philippic. What was Cicero's angle here? He was a friend of the conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, and others. And Antony's continued presence in Rome made it impossible to restore the political careers of the men that had assassinated Julius Caesar. Cicero wanted Antony out of office. He wanted him out of office in disgrace so that Brutus, Cassius, and the others could be restored and the Republic could move on. So Antony at this point was reeling, both from Octavian and then from Cicero. And perhaps acting out of some desperation to regain an edge, Mark Antony made the first of his many blunders, a series of moves that would see him gradually snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And what was his first big blunder? Well, after he finished his year as consul, end of 44 BC, Antony was slated to serve as governor of the province of Macedonia. That's over in Greece. And this was a good province to have. You could tax Macedonia. You could easily live a very debauched life in Macedonia, which Antony surely wanted to do. But Antony would not go silently into that good night. He would not ride eastwards to Macedonia and into his retirement. So instead of marching east at the end of his consulship, he gathered what remained of his private army and took it northwest to Gaul, a province that was more associated with Julius Caesar than anywhere else in the Roman Empire. And he decided to take it as his own from the governor that was already there. Now, when the Senate found out that Mark Antony had marched an army into Gaul, Cicero got what he wanted. The Senate declared Mark Antony, who was just consul, an enemy of the Roman state. And so in a matter of weeks, Mark Antony went from head of the Roman state to public enemy number one. But Cicero was not done yet. Cicero lobbied for the Senate to send both of the new consuls for the year 43 after Mark Antony, and also a third man, a promising young man. Yep, that's right, young Octavian, 19 years old, was made a Roman senator well before the normal age, and then he was bestowed a special irregular command to lead his private army against Mark Antony. Here was a true stroke of genius from Cicero, because he's now pitting the two leading Caesarian loyalists, Mark Antony and Octavian, against each other. Hopefully, at least one of them ends up dead, and for Cicero, maybe both of them. That's what he wants. And in April of 43 BC, the two armies met in Antony's stolen province of Cisalpine Gaul. This is also called Gaul on this side of the Alps. You might also call it Nearer Gaul. Using the present-day map, this province is in the northern part of Italy. Now, the battles between the Senate's army and Mark Antony's army went very badly for Antony, and he ended up retreating well outside of Italy along the southern coast of Gaul, what is now the modern southern coast of France. Octavian survived the fighting as well, but his co-commanders, the two sitting consuls that were sent with him, both died. That left Octavian in charge of the entire army. And strangely, once he was on his own with this much larger army than he started out with, Octavian decided not to chase Antony down. Instead, he stayed in the province of Nearer Gaul, and he sent a group of centurions back to Rome with a list of totally unexpected demands. Number one, Octavian wished the Senate to make him consul now that the two consuls had died. And even more bizarrely, Octavian demanded that the order declaring Antony an enemy of the state be rescinded. What was Octavian playing at here? Why did he want to take Antony, whom he had just been fighting, off the public enemy list? This was all very strange. And of course, the Senate was not going to have any of this. They refused both of the demands of Octavian. Antony was reeling and retreating, and Octavian seemed at this point like an upstart, like a spoiled brat who needed to be put in his place. And many of the senators, no doubt, even regretted allowing him to lead the army and to join their number prematurely. But Octavian was not throwing a tantrum. He was serious. And when he learned that the Senate refused both his demands, he decided to start marching that army. He didn't go towards Antony, he turned it around, marched it towards Rome. Octavian, just like Caesar before him, crossed over with an army into Italy, shocking everyone. You'd think they would get used to people marching on Rome at this point, but they still didn't expect it. And then Octavian took the city of Rome by force. And by the 8th month of the year, Octavian, just 20 years old, used an army to make himself consul in Rome. Antony, meanwhile, was licking his wounds, but he was doing that right next to Spain, where Lepidus was governor. And it may not surprise you to learn that the two of them decided to meet and, even more, hashed out an alliance. Now, between Lepidus and Mark Antony were 17 legions of Roman soldiers, probably somewhere between 50 and 80,000 men. But then, most shocking of all, Lepidus and Antony traveled back to northern Italy, and there they met with Octavian, now consul at the head of another army. Once rivals following the death of Caesar, the three men now put aside their differences, combined their armies together, and begun a reign of terror that ended all hope of restoring the Roman Republic. And as we'll learn next time, this new three-headed monster would enact atrocities on a level never before witnessed in Rome. It was the last and most painful of the contractions that gave birth to the Pax Romana.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exoclaw. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.